There's just one family I know who already has Fragile X. I remember asking the doctor, do you think Rishabh was fine? My siblings did so much research for me because I was told that you're worrying about your son too much. One of the doctors said, have another child, it'll all be okay. We do depend on doctors, which is always aware. It's important to be aware. I've known Shalini 25 years, just imagine.
Oh my God.
My God, Shalini, you look the same.
I don't know about that, but
Yeah.
I remember that phone call because you specifically said, Shalini, please come alone. Don't bring your child. And
Why would I have said that though?
you said that you weren't ready to see another child at that point. And
No, I think maybe I would have said this because it might have aggravated some behavior in the boys or something.
something.
Oh, I don't know. I
something.
don't know. I wouldn't have said that. I mean, I
No, you.
can't think of anything. But I do remember it was early 2000, and now I'm clear about it. It was early 2000, and we were trying to get the test done, and it took us some time because we got ourselves tested at Jaslok, and then we didn't believe it. So we actually went to Delhi. There was a Dr. Telma at the
Right.
genetics lab in Delhi University. So we went there to get ourselves tested again. And at that point, Vibha had said that there's just one family I know who already has Fragile X. When was it when Varun got diagnosed?
In
1999?
99.
Yeah, so similar then at
99,
the same time.
right.
Right. So she said, why don't you meet up? You guys should get together. That's when I said, okay,
Yes.
let's get together. And I remember you were all proper. And
Sari.
Sari.
I came in a sari, bindi, ponytail, typical Marwadi house lady. And I remember bringing Varun's album and showing you pictures of Varun and talking about him. And I was shocked because your living room was filled with books on Fragile X. And I was like, why would you be doing that?
Yeah,
And
because I was so curious. I wanted to know everything that there was on Fragile X. And my sister was in the US. So within a few days of the diagnosis, my family knew. And my sister bought every possible document, book, or anything that was there on Fragile X and posted it to us. So I started reading and researching on everything, and the internet was very new. And I still have those papers. It's interesting, huh? I still have those papers. She used to photocopy documents in the US and she used to just send them to me. Not too many doctors knew about Fragile X, right? So every time I went to somebody, I had
take
to
a
explain and I had to. So I had to read up, and the amount of research that I've done on Fragile X though. For the first few years. I mean, I continue, but I know, what you said about the books. I had every possible book, story, or anything there is on Fragile X. I've read it because I think when Rishabh got diagnosed, I was so relieved because I kept thinking there was something. And every time I'd speak to a pediatrician about him saying, I'm not so sure. And he would say, tell me the symptom. And I would say, pata nahi, thoda hyper hai. But, it was always thoda ye hai. Thoda wo hai, he throws a tantrum, he's difficult to manage. It would never be something concrete, which if it was Rohan before Rishabh, I would have had to say, oh, he's not talking, there were milestones are not normal. In Rishabh's case, the milestones were normal. It was only just that, you've met Rishabh, right? It was
Right.
just that as a baby, it's very difficult to spot that one thing saying, well, for instance, hyperarousal, which is Rishabh's biggest problem even until today. It's not something you can quantify with an infant. How can you say कि ये public को देख के hyper हो जाता है? You can't. So I could never pinpoint it, but I do remember asking, he once had a surgery, a hernia surgery. I remember asking the doctor, do you think Rishabh was fine? I've always wondered if there was something. And I remember him telling me that no, when a child comes out of anesthesia, you can tell if the person's not completely okay. And he said, and your kid woke up and said, I want my mother, or whatever. So he's very normal. And I'd asked this question to 2 or 3 places every time I got an opportunity to. I can never forget it when Vibha said, she asked me, have you heard of autism? And I said, yeah, I'd read a book on autism, or some story on something about an autistic boy. And I said, yeah, I've heard the term. And she said, well, I'm not so sure he's autistic. But if autism has 40 characteristics, Rishabh has 10 of them. And I remember being so relieved that, I've been wondering, thinking that it was an easy thing. Chalo, thank God, at least I know there's a problem and now I will figure out how to deal with it. So my प्लान वाज कि सब कुछ पढ़ के अब रिसर्च करके मैं इसकी सॉल्व कर दूंगी प्रॉब्लम.
रिपेयर हो जाएगा.
That was it. So you were part of my, let's meet another parent now. Let's see, research.
Absolutely.
What's happening. But it was a good thing. 25 years.
So I think I had equal amount of books, but they were all hidden. Because I hadn't told anyone in my family what the diagnosis was. It was too new. It was a taboo. I had a lot of fear in me. And I was like trying to, get him to achieve his milestones. And then I see you with 2 children and how your elder one just incidentally got the diagnosis because of the younger one, because you'd taken him one day to the doctor.
That really crashed my world a bit though.
Yeah.
The fact that when I took Rohan to the clinic, actually I took him by mistake. You know that, right?
Yeah.
I had my maid wasn't there or some such thing.
Yeah, I remember.
So I remember taking him as a baby, and he was such a lovely angel. He was our angel.
Yeah.
So I took him and I put him in that baby basket, and I tell Vibha, Rohan's a very peaceful child. He doesn't bother. And she kept looking and she said, I need to see him first.
Right.
And it was only because of, and I was
Yeah.
I was so upset, and I said, there's nothing wrong with Rohan.
Yeah.
And then she said, no. Rohan bothers me more. And that, I think, really, where at Rishabh's diagnosis of that mild, whatever, 10 PDD, NOS, whatever they call it in the early days, was relief. Rohan's pretty much crashed my world a bit.
Yeah.
See, when you were talking about the fact that I had books and things, it's also because I lived in a nuclear setup. I didn't have family in Bombay.
Yeah.
And it was just me and the kids.
Right.
And my husband, who was away at work most of the time, right? So I think it was easier for me to read and to research and to try and find. And I think it's fabulous when you're a bunch of sisters, because my siblings did so much research for me.
Right.
I know my sister in the US did everything possible. She said, you come here, we'll do this or whatever. The amount of information, the amount of agencies she contacted to be able to give me any amount of information was fabulous.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot about strategies and coping things by reading those.
Yes. You had to, because there was nothing else. And you didn't even have access to all of that in India. So
But
you
the good
just
thing
had
I did, I have to say, is that we were in Delhi before we moved, and we spent a lot of time in Delhi because my husband's parents are in Delhi. So I had spoken to a couple of doctors in Delhi, plus I had 2 pediatricians in Bombay. And I do remember after the diagnosis going to Delhi, just taking an appointment and walking up to them saying, I asked you, I want to tell you so that it doesn't happen again to anybody else. And I want to tell you because I was told that you're worrying about your son too much. And I think this is causing anxiety in you. One of the doctors said, have another child, it'll all be okay. And when I got the diagnosis, I remember going back to the hospital in Delhi when I was visiting. And I said, doctor, I kept asking, he was my earliest pediatrician. And I said, I always wondered, and I spoke to you about my fears, and you didn't say, you said everything is fine. And I want to tell you that this is what he's diagnosed with. And it was interesting because he said, it's a term that we may have heard, but they didn't know anybody with it. It was just a theoretical term that he may have heard of.
Yeah.
So he wasn't able to connect it. And especially because, like I said, in an infant, unless there's something, delayed milestones, Fragile X can go unnoticed, right? In the early,
Absolutely.
I see it now between my 2 children, and there's a difference between their milestones. But as an infant, it's difficult. I would have found it difficult also as a doctor to see my own child because there was just no concrete symptom. What could you say?
Yeah.
And like I said, I had taken Rishabh to a child psychologist, and he had said, you're concentrating and worrying too much about your child. What does it mean to have a hyper child? I used the word hyper because I didn't know what else to use. And he said, I remember he said, have another baby. And I had another baby. Right?
And today we are here so that it doesn't happen to millions of families who watch this. Yeah. And
so if you think there's something amiss, I think a mother has that feeling. I did. And I think it's all right to explore. We do depend on doctors, but it's always aware. It's important to be aware. Don't be paranoid, but it's important to be aware.
Of course.
All the same time.
And get in touch with us if you need to.